Part 1. The Move to the Old House. My name is Lisa, and I've always considered myself a rational person. Ghosts, demons, curses. Those were things for horror movies, not real life. But that all changed when I moved into that house. It was an old house left to me by my grandmother after her death. I hadn't even known she owned it. She'd lived there alone for the last 20 years, and she never once mentioned it to me. If it hadn't been for the letter from her lawyer, I would have never known it existed. The letter stated that the house was now mine, and I could do with it as I pleased. At the time it felt like a blessing. I was drowning in student debt, barely making rent in my tiny apartment, and the idea of owning a house, even an old one, felt like a lifeline. The house was located in a small, forgotten town called Black Hollow. I'd never heard of it, and when I looked it up, there wasn't much to find. A few scattered photos of a sleepy town surrounded by dense woods, a handful of reviews for a diner that supposedly had the best pie in the state, and that was about it. It felt like stepping into a different era, one where time had simply stopped. The drive there was uneventful, though the closer I got, the more the landscape seemed to shift. The trees grew taller, their branches twisting together to form a canopy that blocked out the sun. The road narrowed, and the GPS started glitching, telling me to turn onto roads that didn't exist. By the time I reached the town, I was exhausted and on edge. The house itself was imposing. It was a Victorian-style home with peeling paint, sagging shutters, and a wraparound porch that creaked with every step. It looked like something out of a Gothic novel, and I half expected to see a shadowy figure standing in one of the upstairs windows watching me. But there was no one. Just the house, silent and waiting. The key the lawyer had sent me fit perfectly into the lock, and with a loud click the door swung open. The air inside was thick with dust and the faint smell of mildew. The furniture was covered in white sheets, and the floorboards groaned under my weight as I stepped inside. It felt like the house was alive, like it was breathing, and I was an intruder in its lungs. I spent the first day cleaning, trying to make the place feel less like a tomb and more like a home. But no matter how much I scrubbed, the air remained heavy, oppressive. By nightfall I was too tired to care. I set up a makeshift bed in the living room, too exhausted to tackle the upstairs, and fell asleep almost instantly. That's when the dreams started. I was standing in the house, but it wasn't the same house. The walls were pristine, the furniture polished, and the air smelled of fresh flowers. I could hear laughter, faint and distant, like echoes from another room. I followed the sound, my footsteps silent on the carpeted floor. The laughter led me to the kitchen, where a woman stood at the counter, humming to herself as she chopped vegetables. She had her back to me, but I could tell she was young, her dark hair tied up in a loose bun. "Hello," I called out, but she didn't respond. I stepped closer, reaching out to touch her shoulder, but my hand passed right through her. She turned then, and I saw her face. It was my grandmother, but not as I remembered her. She was younger, her face unlined, her eyes bright. But there was something wrong. Her smile was too wide, her eyes too dark, and when she spoke, her voice was a whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You shouldn't have come here." I woke up gasping, my heart pounding in my chest. The room was dark, the only light coming from the moon outside. I told myself it was just a dream, a product of stress and exhaustion. But as I lay there trying to calm my racing heart, I heard it. A faint scratching sound like nails dragging across wood. It was coming from the hallway. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The sound grew louder, closer, until it was right outside the door. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. I was paralyzed, my body refusing to obey my brain. The door creaked open and I saw it. A shadow, tall and hunched, standing in the doorway. It didn't move, didn't speak, but I could feel its eyes on me, burning into my soul. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. The door slammed shut and the room was silent once more. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning I tried to convince myself it had all been a nightmare. But the scratches on the doorframe told a different story. Deep, jagged marks, like something had been trying to claw its way in. Or out. I spent the day exploring the house, trying to distract myself from the growing sense of unease. The upstairs was even creepier than the downstairs, with narrow hallways and rooms that seemed to go on forever. One room in particular caught my attention. A small bedroom at the end of the hall. The walls were covered in faded wallpaper and the floor was littered with broken toys. A dollhouse sat in the corner, its tiny furniture scattered as if a child had been playing with it moments before. But what really caught my eye was the journal. It was lying on the bed, its pages yellowed with age. I picked it up, my fingers trembling as I flipped through the pages. The handwriting was messy, almost frantic, and the entries were short and disjointed. It's in the walls. I can hear it scratching at night. It's watching me. The last entry was dated the day my grandmother died. It read, "It's too late for me. But maybe not for you. Don't let it in." I didn't know what to make of it. Was it some kind of prank? A metaphor for her mental state? Or was it something worse, something I couldn't even begin to understand? That night the scratching returned. But this time it wasn't outside the door. It was inside the walls. Part 2, the whispers in the walls. The scratching in the walls didn't stop. It was constant, a relentless rhythm that seemed to echo through the entire house. I tried to ignore it, to convince myself it was just rats or some other vermin. But deep down I knew it wasn't that simple. The sound was too deliberate, too intentional. It was as if whatever was making that noise wanted me to hear it, wanted me to know it was there. I spent the next few days avoiding the upstairs, sticking to the main floor where the sunlight could still reach me. But even during the day the house felt wrong. The air was too still, too heavy, and every creak of the floorboards made me jump. I started to notice other things too, small, subtle things that I couldn't explain. Doors would creak open on their own, the temperature would drop suddenly, and sometimes out of the corner of my eye, I'd see shadows moving where there shouldn't be any. The journal I'd found in the upstairs bedroom became my only source of comfort. I read it over and over, trying to make sense of my grandmother's words. Most of the entries were cryptic, filled with references to it and warnings to stay away from certain parts of the house. But one entry stood out, dated just a week before her death. "I found the key today. It was hidden in the dollhouse just like she said it would be. I don't know what it opens, but I know it's important. I can feel it. The house doesn't want me to have it. I can hear it screaming at night, scratching at the walls, trying to get to me. But I won't let it win. Not this time." My grandmother had mentioned a key. I didn't know what it opened, but I knew I had to find it. If it was important enough for her to write about, maybe it could help me understand what was happening in this house. I started my search in the upstairs bedroom, the one where I'd found the journal. The dollhouse was still there, its tiny furniture scattered across the floor. I knelt down beside it, my hands trembling as I reached inside. The dollhouse was old, its paint chipped and faded, but it was surprisingly detailed. There were tiny beds, chairs, even a miniature fireplace. I searched every inch of it, my fingers brushing against the tiny walls and floors, but there was no key. Frustrated, I sat back on my heels, staring at the dollhouse. Maybe I was missing something. Maybe the key wasn't inside the dollhouse itself, but hidden somewhere nearby. I started to search the room, pulling open drawers, lifting up rugs, even checking under the bed. But there was nothing. As I was about to give up, I noticed something strange about the wallpaper. In one corner of the room, the pattern seemed slightly off, as if a piece had been removed and replaced. I ran my fingers over it, feeling for any irregularities. Sure enough, there was a small gap where the wallpaper didn't quite meet the wall. I peeled it back carefully, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside was a small rusted key. My heart raced as I held it in my hand. It was old, the metal tarnished and worn, but it felt heavy, important. I didn't know what it opened, but I knew I had to find out. The rest of the day was spent searching the house for anything that might match the key. I checked every door, every cabinet, every locked drawer I could find. But nothing fit. It wasn't until I was about to give up that I remembered the basement. I hadn't been down there yet. The thought of going into the dark, damp space filled me with dread, but I knew I had to do it. If the key opened something in the basement, it could be the answer to everything. The basement door was in the kitchen, a heavy wooden thing with a rusted lock. I inserted the key, my hands shaking as I turned it. The lock clicked open and the door creaked as I pushed it open. A wave of cold, damp air hit me, carrying with it the smell of mildew and something else, something metallic. I grabbed a flashlight and descended the stairs, each step creaking under my weight. The basement was exactly what I expected. Dark, damp, and filled with old, forgotten things. Boxes of my grandmother's belongings were stacked against the walls, their contents long since forgotten. But in the center of the room was something that made my blood run cold. A door. It was small, barely tall enough for a child to walk through, and made of heavy, weathered wood. The surface was covered in strange symbols, carved deep into the grain. They looked like runes, ancient and menacing, and they seemed to pulse faintly in the dim light. The door had no handle, just a keyhole. I knew without a doubt that this was what the key was for. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the keyhole. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to turn back, to leave the door closed. But I couldn't. I had to know what was behind it. I inserted the key and turned it. The door swung open with a loud creak, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. The air that wafted up was cold and stale, carrying with it the faint scent of decay. I shone my flashlight down the stairs, but the beam barely penetrated the gloom. I took a deep breath and started down the stairs. The staircase seemed to go on forever, the walls closing in around me as I descended. The air grew colder with each step and the smell of decay grew stronger. By the time I reached the bottom, I was shivering, my breath visible in the cold air. The room at the bottom was small and circular, the walls made of rough stone. In the center of the room was a pedestal, and on top of it was a book. It was old, its leather cover cracked and peeling, and it seemed to radiate a strange, almost palpable energy. I approached it cautiously, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The book was bound with a thick leather strap, and the cover was inscribed with the same runes that had been on the door. I reached out to touch it, but as soon as my fingers brushed the cover, a wave of cold washed over me and I heard it. A whisper, faint and distant but unmistakable. "Don't." I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The whisper had come from behind me. I turned slowly, my flashlight illuminating the empty room. There was no one there. But the whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, more insistent, filling the room with a cacophony of voices. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but the tone was clear. Anger, fear, desperation. I backed away from the pedestal, my hands trembling, but the whispers followed me, growing louder and louder until they were deafening. I turned and ran, scrambling up the stairs as fast as I could. The whispers followed me, echoing in my ears, and I didn't stop until I was back in the kitchen, slamming the basement door shut behind me. I leaned against the door, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The whispers had stopped, but the memory of them lingered, haunting me. I didn't know what was in that book, but I knew one thing. I had to get rid of it. Part 3, The Book of Shadows. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the whispers, faint, insistent, and filled with a malice that made my skin crawl. The book was still in the basement, but its presence seemed to permeate the entire house. I could feel it like a weight pressing down on my chest, suffocating me. The next morning, I decided I had to do something about it. I couldn't just leave the book there, not after what I'd experienced. But I also couldn't bring myself to go back down into the basement. The thought of facing that room again, of hearing those whispers, filled me with a dread I couldn't shake. Instead, I called the only person I could think of who might be able to help. My best friend, Sarah. She'd always been the rational one, the one who could talk me down from my worst anxieties. If anyone could help me make sense of this, it was her. "Lisa, you're freaking me out," Sarah said when I told her about the book and the whispers. "Are you sure you're okay? Maybe you're just stressed from the move." "I'm not imagining this, Sarah," I said, my voice trembling. "There's something wrong with this house. I can feel it." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Okay," she said finally. "I'll come over. But if this is some kind of prank, I'm going to kill you." Sarah arrived that afternoon, her usual bubbly self, but I could see the concern in her eyes as she took in the state of the house. "Wow," she said, looking around. "This place is creepy." "You have no idea," I muttered. I led her to the basement door, my hands trembling as I unlocked it. Sarah followed me down the stairs, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. When we reached the bottom, she stopped, staring at the small circular room with the pedestal in the center. "What the hell is this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's what I'm trying to figure out," I said, shining my flashlight on the book. "I found this yesterday. It's, I don't know, some kind of ancient book. But when I touched it, I heard these whispers. They were everywhere, Sarah. And they felt angry." Sarah frowned, stepping closer to the pedestal. "It's probably just some old family heirloom. Maybe your grandmother was into weird stuff. You know, like seances or whatever." "It's not just that," I said, my voice rising. "There's something wrong with this house. I hear scratching in the walls, I see shadows moving, and last night I swear I saw something standing in my doorway." Sarah looked at me, her expression softening. "Lisa, you've been through a lot. Moving to a new place, dealing with your grandmother's death. It's a lot to handle. Maybe you're just overwhelmed. I wanted to argue to make her understand, but I knew she wouldn't believe me unless she saw it for herself. Just help me get rid of the book, I said finally. Please. Sarah hesitated, then nodded. Hey, but if this thing starts whispering at me, I'm out of here. We approached the pedestal together, the air growing colder with each step. The book seemed to pulse with a dark energy, the runes on its cover glowing faintly in the dim light. Sarah reached out to touch it, but I grabbed her arm. Don't, I said, my voice trembling. Just let me do it. I took a deep breath and reached for the book. As soon as my fingers touched the cover, the whispers started again. Faint at first, then growing louder, more insistent. I could feel them in my mind, pressing against my thoughts, trying to take over. Leave it. You don't understand. It's too late. I gritted my teeth, forcing myself to ignore the voices. I grabbed the book and pulled it off the pedestal, the whispers growing louder and more frantic. The air around us seemed to vibrate, the walls trembling as if the house itself was alive. Lisa, what the hell is happening? Sarah shouted, her voice barely audible over the cacophony of whispers. I don't know. I screamed back, clutching the book to my chest. We need to get out of here. We ran up the stairs, the whispers following us, growing louder and more distorted. By the time we reached the kitchen, I was shaking, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Sarah slammed the basement door shut, leaning against it as if to keep whatever was down there from escaping. What the hell was that? She demanded, her face pale. I told you, I said, my voice trembling. There's something wrong with this house. Sarah stared at me, her expression a mix of fear and disbelief. We need to get rid of that book, she said finally. Now. We decided to burn it. It seemed like the only way to be sure it was gone for good. We built a fire in the backyard, the flames crackling and spitting as we tossed the book into the fire. For a moment nothing happened. Then the flames turned black, and the air was filled with a deafening scream. It wasn't human. It was something else, something ancient and malevolent. The scream seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, echoing in my mind long after the flames had died down. When it was over, the book was gone, reduced to ashes. But the whispers didn't stop. If anything, they grew louder, more insistent. And that's when I realized, the book wasn't the source of the evil in the house. It was just a piece of it. Part 4. The House Awakens. The days after burning the book were a blur. The whispers didn't stop. If anything, they grew louder, more insistent. They followed me everywhere, a constant hum in the back of my mind. I tried to ignore them, to convince myself it was just my imagination, but deep down I knew the truth. The house wasn't just haunted. It was alive. Sarah stayed with me for a few days, but even she couldn't handle the constant unease. Lisa, this place is messing with your head, she said before she left. You need to get out of here. Sell the house, burn it down, I don't care. Just get out. I wanted to leave. God, I wanted to leave. But something kept me there, something I couldn't explain. It was like the house had a hold on me, a grip that tightened every time I thought about walking away. And then there were the dreams. They started the night after we burned the book. I was back in the basement, standing in front of the pedestal. The book was there, whole and untouched, its cover glowing faintly in the dark. I reached out to touch it, but before I could, the whispers started, louder than ever, a cacophony of voices that seemed to come from all around me. You shouldn't have done that. Tao, you'll pay. It's too late. I woke up screaming, my heart pounding in my chest. The room was dark, the only light coming from the moon outside. But something was different. The air was heavier, thicker, and the shadows seemed to move on their own, twisting and writhing like living things. I got out of bed, my legs trembling as I made my way to the window. The yard was bathed in moonlight, the trees swaying gently in the breeze. But something was wrong. The shadows didn't match the trees. They were too tall, too thin, and they moved in ways that defied logic. I backed away from the window, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The whispers were louder now, filling the room with a low, guttural growl. I could feel them in my chest, vibrating through my bones. And then I saw it. A shadow, tall and hunched, standing in the corner of the room. It didn't move, didn't speak, but I could feel its eyes on me, burning into my soul. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. I was frozen, paralyzed by a fear so deep it felt like it would consume me. The shadow stepped forward, its form shifting and twisting as it moved. It wasn't human, not anymore. Its limbs were too long, its movements too fluid, and its face. God, its face. It was a void, a black hole that seemed to suck the light out of the room. "You shouldn't have burned the book," it said, its voice a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Tao, you'll pay." I woke up screaming, my heart pounding in my chest. The room was dark, the only light coming from the moon outside. But something was different. The air was heavier, thicker, and the shadows seemed to move on their own, twisting and writhing like living things. I got out of bed, my legs trembling as I made my way to the window. The yard was bathed in moonlight, the trees swaying gently in the breeze. But something was wrong. The shadows didn't match the trees. They were too tall, too thin, and they moved in ways that defied logic. I backed away from the window, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The whispers were louder now, filling the room with a low, guttural growl. I could feel them in my chest, vibrating through my bones. And then I saw it. A shadow, tall and hunched, standing in the corner of the room. It didn't move, didn't speak, but I could feel its eyes on me, burning into my soul. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. I was frozen, paralyzed by a fear so deep it felt like it would consume me. The shadow stepped forward, its form shifting and twisting as it moved. It wasn't human, not anymore. Its limbs were too long, its movements too fluid, and its face. God, its face. It was a void, a black hole that seemed to suck the light out of the room. "You shouldn't have burned the book," it said, its voice a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Tao, you'll pay." I woke up screaming, my heart pounding in my chest. The room was dark, the only light coming from the moon outside. But something was different. The air was heavier, thicker, and the shadows seemed to move on their own, twisting and writhing like living things. I got out of bed, my legs trembling as I made my way to the window. The yard was bathed in moonlight, the trees swaying gently in the breeze. But something was wrong. The shadows didn't match the trees. They were too tall, too thin, and they moved in ways that defied logic. I backed away from the window, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The whispers were louder now, filling the room with a low, guttural growl. I could feel them in my chest, vibrating through my bones. And then I saw it. A shadow, tall and hunched, standing in the corner of the room. It didn't move, didn't speak, but I could feel its eyes on me, burning into my soul. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. I was frozen, paralyzed by a fear so deep it felt like it would consume me. The shadow stepped forward, its form shifting and twisting as it moved. It wasn't human, not anymore. Its limbs were too long, its movements too fluid, and its face. God, its face. It was a void, a black hole that seemed to suck the light out of the room. "You shouldn't have burned the book," it said, its voice a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Tao, you'll pay." Part 5. The final confrontation. The shadow didn't move. It just stood there, its void-like face staring at me, its presence filling the room with a suffocating darkness. I could feel its malice, its hunger, and I knew this thing wasn't just a shadow. It was the house. Or maybe it was something that had been trapped in the house, something that had been waiting for me. "You shouldn't have burned the book," it said again, its voice echoing in my mind. "Tao, you'll pay." I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't obey. I was frozen, trapped in its gaze. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, until they were a deafening roar in my ears. I could feel them pressing against my mind, trying to break through, to take over. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the shadow was gone. The room was silent, the whispers fading into nothingness. I collapsed to the floor, my legs giving out beneath me. My heart was pounding, my breath coming in ragged gasps, but I was alive. For now. I knew I couldn't stay in the house. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't going to let me go. I had to leave, to get as far away from this place as possible. But even as I thought it, I knew it wouldn't be that easy. The house had a hold on me, a grip that tightened every time I tried to pull away. I packed a bag as quickly as I could, throwing in clothes, my phone, and whatever else I thought I might need. I didn't know where I was going, but it didn't matter. Anywhere was better than here. But as I reached for the front door, it slammed shut in my face. I pulled on the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The windows were next, but they were locked tight, the glass fogging over as if the house itself was breathing. "You can't leave," the whispers said, their voices overlapping in a chaotic symphony. "You belong to us now." I backed away from the door, my heart racing. The house was alive, and it wasn't going to let me go. I had to fight back to find a way to break its hold on me. But how? And then I remembered the journal. My grandmother had written about the house, about the things she'd seen and heard. Maybe there was something in there, some clue that could help me. I ran to the living room where I'd left the journal on the coffee table. The pages were yellowed and brittle, but the handwriting was still legible. I flipped through them, scanning the entries for anything that might help. "It's in the walls," one entry read. "It's always been in the walls." The book was just a key, a way to keep it locked away. But now the key is gone and it's free. My heart sank. The book wasn't the source of the evil. It was a lock, a way to keep whatever was in the house contained. And I'd destroyed it. "There's only one way to stop it," the next entry read. "You have to find the heart of the house. That's where it lives. That's where it's strongest. But be careful. It won't let you go without a fight." The heart of the house. I didn't know what that meant, but I knew I had to find it. It was the only way to end this. I grabbed a flashlight and headed for the basement. The door creaked open, the air inside cold and damp. The stairs groaned under my weight as I descended, the darkness closing in around me. The whispers were louder here, more insistent, but I forced myself to ignore them. The room at the bottom of the stairs was just as I remembered it. Small, circular, and filled with an oppressive energy. The pedestal was still there, but the book was gone, reduced to ashes. I shone my flashlight around the room, looking for anything that might be the heart of the house. And then I saw it. In the center of the room, hidden beneath the pedestal, was a trapdoor. It was small, barely large enough for a person to fit through, and covered in the same runes that had been on the book. I knelt down, my hands trembling as I pulled it open. A wave of cold air hit me, carrying with it the smell of decay. The trapdoor led to a narrow tunnel, the walls made of rough stone. I shone my flashlight down the tunnel, but the beam barely penetrated the darkness. I didn't want to go down there, but I knew I had to. This was the heart of the house, the source of its evil. I took a deep breath and started down the tunnel. The tunnel seemed to go on forever, the walls closing in around me as I descended. The air grew colder with each step, and the smell of decay grew stronger. By the time I reached the bottom, I was shivering, my breath visible in the cold air. The room at the bottom was small and circular, the walls made of rough stone. In the center of the room was a pedestal, and on top of it was a heart. A real, beating heart. It was black and pulsing, its surface covered in the same runes that had been on the book. The air around it seemed to vibrate, the whispers growing louder and more frantic. I knew what I had to do. I stepped forward, my hands trembling as I reached for the heart. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, but I forced myself to ignore them. I grabbed the heart, its surface cold and slimy, and pulled it off the pedestal. The house screamed. It was a sound unlike anything I'd ever heard. A deafening, guttural roar that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The walls shook, the floor trembling beneath my feet as the house fought to keep its hold on me. But I didn't let go. I held onto the heart, my hands tightening around it as I squeezed. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, until they were a deafening roar in my ears. I could feel them pressing against my mind, trying to break through, to take over. And then, with a final ear-splitting scream, the heart burst. The house went silent. So that was my story. The house that was supposed to be my salvation turned out to be my worst nightmare. To this day, I still don't know what exactly was in that house, and honestly, I don't want to know. But one thing's for sure. Sometimes the scariest things hide where we least expect them. If you enjoyed this story, give this video a like and subscribe to the channel. Here I share my strange, terrifying, and supernatural experiences, as well as stories that make you question what lies beyond the edges of our understanding. And of course, let me know in the comments, what would you have done in my place? Could you have stayed in a house like that? Or maybe you have your own creepy stories to share. Let's discuss. Don't forget to hit the bell icon so you don't miss any new videos. Thank you for being with me today. I'll see you in the next one. Take care of yourselves and remember, not all houses are meant to be lived in.